Mark Callahan was the town's most trusted police officer, Alaya was his bright, ambitious stepdaughter, and Kendra Davis was the young neighbor who unknowingly lit the fuse of a deadly secret. By the time their lives collided, one would be buried in a shallow grave, one would be branded a killer, and the other would carry the truth no one wanted to believe. This is the shocking story of how a respected cop's hidden racism, lust, and obsession with control led to cold-blooded murder, all to protect the lie he built around his perfect life. Detective Mark Callahan was everything his town wanted in a hero. Clean-shaven, sharp in his uniform, firm in his handshake, and always first to show up at charity events or church fundraisers. To his neighbors, he was the definition of stability. His wife, Susan, was a local school teacher known for her sweet voice and friendly smile, and their home sat neatly on a quiet suburban street lined with trimmed hedges and polished mailboxes. To anyone passing by, their life looked like a photograph from a community magazine, happy, safe, and respectable. But what no one could see was how carefully that image had been constructed. Mark wasn't just proud of his standing in the community. He was obsessed with it. His entire life was built on appearance and control. Every promotion at the precinct, every handshake with a local politician, every family photo on social media served one purpose: maintaining the illusion of a perfect man living a perfect life. And that included being a devoted husband and father, Alaya. His 17-year-old stepdaughter was a bright and ambitious young woman. She dreamed of going to college, of studying journalism, of leaving behind the small-town life for something bigger, something freer. Alaya's father, a man Susan had divorced years before, wasn't in the picture, so Mark became her father figure. At least that's what the community thought. But behind the closed doors of their house, Mark never treated Alaya as his own. His smiles at family dinners were forced, his praise uncomfortable, his hugs stiff and shallow. And while Susan worked overtime to make their blended family seem like a unit, Mark kept his distance, not just physically, but emotionally. His resentment was quiet but constant. There was another layer to Mark that no one in public saw. Beneath the uniform, beneath the sermons about responsibility and law and order, Mark held tightly to racist views passed down like family heirlooms. His resentment wasn't just toward Alaya as his stepdaughter, it was tangled with his hatred of the fact that she was black. It gnawed at him in ways he couldn't speak out loud, not in today's world, not with cameras always pointed and cell phones always recording. So he kept it buried, smiling for photos with the very family that disgusted him in secret. The hypocrisy might have eaten someone else alive. But for Mark, it was just part of the role. A role he played so well that no one, not even Susan, suspected the truth. That's why when Mark met Kendra Davis, it wasn't just a betrayal, it was reckless. Kendra was young, beautiful, and ambitious, having just moved into the neighborhood hoping for a fresh start. She was also black. The very people Mark claimed to despise were the same people he lusted after in secret. For Mark, the affair wasn't love. It was about control, about feeding the parts of himself he denied publicly. The risk excited him. And with every meeting, every lie, and every excuse to his wife, the walls of his perfect life started to crack, one hairline fracture at a time. For a while, Mark thought he could handle the affair like he handled everything else in his life, with careful lies, strict routines, and complete control. He met Kendra on the outskirts of town, never near familiar places, always making sure no one recognized him. Kendra had no idea about the man he was at home, the secret bitterness he carried, or the fragile web he'd woven to hold his life together. To her, he was just another older white man who liked the way she looked and talked about helping her find better work. She didn't know how deep his lies went, or how dangerous they could become. The more time Mark spent with Kendra, the more reckless he became. What began as late-night texts and secret motel visits soon bled into his daily life. He would sneak out under the excuse of work emergencies. He started missing family dinners, leaving Susan to cover for him with polite smiles and weak explanations to friends. The carefully polished image he worked so hard to maintain was beginning to slip. But Mark didn't care. The thrill of the deception fed something inside him, something ugly, something that had been there long before Kendra came into the picture. But secrets, especially ones built on betrayal, have a way of slipping through even the tightest grips. One evening, Mark left his phone unlocked in the kitchen while he showered. Alaya, looking for her own charger, noticed the phone buzzing with messages. What caught her attention wasn't just the frequency of the messages, but the name attached to them. Kendra. Curiosity turned into dread as she scrolled through texts that left nothing to the imagination. Photographs, hotel addresses, plans. The words made her stomach turn. Alaya sat in shock, realizing that the man who paraded as her father figure was not just unfaithful, but actively living a double life. But it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about danger. She knew how careful Mark was with his reputation, how much importance he placed on what others thought of him. A scandal like this wouldn't just ruin his career, it would destroy the very identity he'd built for himself. And that made him unpredictable. For days, Alaya debated whether to tell her mother. She wrestled with it alone, replaying scenarios in her head, imagining the fallout. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't stay silent. It wasn't just about Susan being betrayed, it was about the hypocrisy, the lies, and the quiet hatred she had felt in Mark's presence for years, but could never quite explain. Now it all made sense. His coldness, his discomfort around her friends, his forced, awkward affection. When she finally confronted him, it wasn't in anger. It was in quiet determination. She made it clear that if he didn't come clean to her, mother, she would. For Mark, it wasn't just a teenage threat. It was a direct attack on the empire he had spent years building. And in that moment, the mask slipped. The loving stepfather and upstanding detective disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous, something capable of anything to keep the lie alive. The night of Alaya's disappearance began like any other in their quiet neighborhood. The streetlights hummed softly, and the air carried the first chill of approaching winter. Susan thought Alaya was upstairs working on a school project or maybe out with friends, something normal for a teenager preparing for college. Nothing about that evening seemed unusual at first glance. Behind the calm, though, Mark had already decided what had to be done. He had convinced himself that Alaya was the problem, that her knowledge of the affair was a threat, not just to his career, but to his entire existence. In Mark's twisted mind, it was simple. Remove the threat, restore control, and life could return to normal. Mark's plan was cold and deliberate. He approached Alaya that evening with a forced calm, pretending they could talk things over privately, like adults. He played the role of a father figure once more, acting like he wanted to explain himself, pretending to be ashamed of his actions, all while hiding what he really intended to do. Alaya, despite her instincts screaming otherwise, followed him. Maybe she hoped for an honest conversation, maybe she just wanted closure, but deep down she didn't realize how far Mark was willing to go. He didn't drive to a local diner or a quiet park. Instead, he headed for the dense woods outside town, the kind of place people only visited for hunting or camping, not late-night conversations. The road was dark, the trees swallowing every bit of light, and the silence in the car grew heavier with each passing mile. Once they were far enough from prying eyes, Mark pulled over on a dirt trail barely visible from the main road. There was no argument, no last-minute plea, no hesitation. Mark killed Alaya with his bare hands, strangling the life from her with a calmness that only someone truly detached could manage. In his mind, it wasn't murder. It was problem-solving. It was cleaning up a mess he blamed on everyone but himself. Afterward, He buried her quickly in a shallow grave, using a small camping shovel he'd packed earlier that day. The dirt barely covered the evidence of what had happened, but Mark wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He wasn't concerned with perfection anymore, only escape. He left her there, in the cold ground, as if she were nothing, as if her life and dreams and ambitions didn't matter. By the time he got home, Mark had slipped effortlessly back into his familiar routine of deception. He washed his hands carefully, cleaned his shoes, and rehearsed the story he would tell. He called friends, contacted the police station, and began creating the image of a panicked stepfather with a runaway daughter. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to cry, exactly when to sound desperate. Mark had spent his whole life practicing lies. This one just happened to be the worst of them all. And for a while, it worked. People believed him. Search parties were formed. Posters were printed. The image of the perfect family, now shattered, was being held together by pure manipulation. As days turned into weeks, the town's search for Alaya grew frantic. Posters with her smiling face covered store windows and telephone poles. Candlelight vigils were held in parks. Neighbors gathered to pray, and local reporters followed every new lead with careful attention. Mark played his role flawlessly, standing beside Susan, offering empty comfort, wiping away fake tears for the cameras. The image of the devastated stepfather was working. People felt sorry for him. Friends from the police department showed up at his house, offering support and promising they would find her. No one suspected that the man comforting the grieving mother was the same one who had killed her daughter. But while Mark believed he had planned everything perfectly, he had overlooked one thing. Technology never forgets. Hidden within the cloud backups of his work phone were fragments of his conversations with Kendra. Small things, deleted text notifications, missed calls, and location data that didn't add up. Mark had been careful, but not careful enough. It was a junior detective on the missing persons task force who noticed it first. Cross-referencing Mark's phone records against the timeline of Alaya's disappearance, they found something strange. Why was he exchanging texts with another woman during the very hours his stepdaughter was supposedly going missing? And why was his phone connecting to a cell tower near the state forest, a place Mark had no reason to be at that time of night? At first, no one wanted to believe it. Mark was one of their own. A decorated officer with commendations, years of service, and a spotless record, or so they thought. But facts didn't lie. As investigators quietly began digging deeper into Mark's life, they uncovered more inconsistencies. His alibi didn't quite hold. Security cameras at gas stations near the forest showed a vehicle matching Mark's police-issued SUV traveling in the same direction Alaya's phone last pinged before going silent. Meanwhile, Kendra was growing uneasy. The affair had shifted from excitement to dread. Mark had become distant and paranoid, snapping at her over the smallest things, constantly checking over his shoulder. And then came the realization that would crack the case wide open. Kendra still had copies of some of the messages on her own phone. She hadn't deleted them. Some were innocent, others explicit, but one in particular sent a chill down the detective's spines. A message from Mark the very night Alaya went missing, telling Kendra that everything's about to change. With this new information, investigators quietly prepared a search team. Using the phone records, GPS data, and analysis of tire tracks from security footage, they zeroed in on the stretch of forest Mark had visited. After days of searching, they found the disturbed earth, the shallow grave, and the undeniable evidence of Mark's guilt. Mark was arrested in his own kitchen, surrounded by the very people who once called him brother. Susan collapsed in grief, realizing not only had she lost her daughter, but that the man she trusted most had been the one to take her life. The mask Mark wore for so long had finally broken, revealing the monster that had been there all along. The trial of Detective Mark Callahan became the most talked-about case the town had ever seen. The man once celebrated as a local hero was now exposed as a liar, a manipulator, and a murderer. News outlets from across the country covered the story, drawing national attention not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the deep hypocrisy at the center of it. A decorated white police officer, married to a white woman, raising a black stepdaughter, had secretly harbored racist beliefs while carrying on an affair with a young black woman. The contradiction was staggering. The community that once praised him now sat in shock, forced to confront the disturbing truth that the man they thought they knew had been wearing a mask the entire time. Inside the courtroom, the evidence spoke, louder than words ever could. The deleted messages, the GPS data, the security footage, the shallow grave, all of it painted a clear picture of a man desperate to protect his image at any cost. But it wasn't just about hiding an affair. The prosecution revealed something far worse. Mark's deep-seated racism was not just a private belief, it was part of his motive. He didn't just want to hide his infidelity. He wanted to erase the evidence of his betrayal with someone he considered beneath him. Kendra's testimony sealed his fate. She stood before the court and described how Mark spoke about protecting his family and how he constantly worried about what people would think if they knew about their relationship. He saw her not as a person, but as a threat to the lie he had built. As the trial unfolded, more pieces of Mark's hidden life came to light. Officers who once worked with him began recalling casual racist comments they had brushed off, thinking he was just joking or letting off steam. His online activity, carefully hidden under anonymous accounts, showed forums and discussions where Mark expressed anger about changing neighborhoods and rising diversity. The man who once stood in front of schools talking about responsibility and leadership had been living two lives, one of public service and one of private hatred. The jury didn't need much time to reach a verdict. Mark was sentenced to life, in prison without the possibility of parole. His career, his family, and his carefully crafted public image were destroyed, not by outsiders, but by his own hands. The same hands that once held awards and shook the hands of city officials were now shackled in chains, dragged away from the courtroom to spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the community, the trial left a scar that would take years to heal. People began questioning who else among them might be hiding behind polite smiles and polished reputations. Susan disappeared from public view, her life broken beyond repair. Kendra moved out of town, carrying the weight of a betrayal she never deserved. And Alaya's memory became a painful reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, wearing the uniform of respectability, until it finally tears everything apart.